So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Aydin Kumler. Dr. Kumler earned a PhD in the history of art and architecture at Harvard University and a licentiate from medieval studies at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. She is associate professor in the departments of art history and romance languages and literatures at the University of Chicago, and an affiliated faculty member of the Medieval Studies program, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and Divinity School. Dr. Kumler's teaching excellence has been recognized with awards in both graduate and undergraduate teaching. She is the author of several books and essays, including her first book, Translating Truth, Ambitious Images and Religious Knowledge in Late Medieval France and England, published by Yale University Press in 2011. She has published essays in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Cabinet Magazine, Res, Studies in Iconology, Gesta, as well as appearing in various edited volumes. This afternoon, Dr. Coomer will be discussing her recent chapter, Materials, Materia, Materiality, from the 2019 volume, Companion to Medieval Art, Romanesque and Gothic in Northern Europe, with students from my Ancient and Medieval Art History course, and we're really excited about that. Dr. Kumler's research interests range widely, but are anchored in a deep interest in how the material conditions of life shape possibilities for thought, imagination, and action. Committed to a rigorously interdisciplinary tradition of Europeanist medieval studies, Kumler aims to critically engage questions and fundamental problems to the history of art and culture writ large. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Aydin Kumler.
I'm really delighted to be here. I'm delighted that so many of you have come. I want to thank David Willett for the kind invitation. I consider it a real honor to be included in a visiting artist series, since I'm an art historian, so I think about artists and I need artists to do my work. I have friends, very good friends, who are contemporary artists, but it's the first time I've been included in a lineup like this, and so I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to just plunge in. An initial letter T, painted in the third volume of the Salzburg Missal, an illuminated manuscript made in the last quarter of the 15th century, presents its beholder with a body at once made and unmade. The body is instantly recognizable as the wounded Christ, inhabiting the central vertical of the large, brilliant letter T that begins the text of the so-called Te Igitur in the Mass for the Feast of Corpus Christi. From a niche surmounted by filigree Gothic pinnacles, crocketing in a diminutive vault, Christ seems to step forward with an almost balletic grace, poised on the edge of some kind of elegant progress from micro-architectural enclosure into a different space, moment, or state of being. An exquisite elaboration on the Man of Sorrows iconographic type, this figure frames the open wound in his side with a delicate gesture. Rivulets of blood run down his ashen lower ribcage. One long droplet hangs suspended in front of the gauzy cloth wrapped around his abdomen. Other drops of blood descend the shadowy curves of his exposed thighs. The initial describes a strange situation. Christ's bleeding wounds are kept open or reopened by the thick, twisting grapevine that pierces his left foot, and by the stalk of wheat that passes through his right foot only to re-enter his left palm. Piercing Christ's diminutive body, outsized vegetal growth reiterates the unmaking of his corporeal integrity worked by the historical crucifixion. At the same time, the longer we look at the painted initial, the harder it becomes, I think, to see in its surface only a meditation on passivity, pain, suffering, as they are understood within Christian accounts of Christ's passion and his ongoing remaking of a fallen humanity. For surely, as Christ steps off the brilliant blue plinth, he gathers the grapevine in the crook of his right arm, and gazing softly down its curving green length, he brings that vibrant vegetation into a kind of embrace. So too, the golden stalk of wheat might be described as not simply piercing his body, but also as advanced with that body's advance, borne forward, flexed, and presented to the beholder's gaze by the top of Christ's foot and by the open palm of his left hand. And if we trace the springing of vine and wheat stalk from their amputated lower ends up through Christ's elegant figure, our eyes pass through or over the intertwining of plant and flesh into the counter space defined by the form of the letter T, a space filled with grape leaves and grapevines, heavy clusters of fruit and curling green tendrils, fuzzy ears of wheat, and perhaps most bizarrely, the white discs of communion wafers, each bearing an image of the crucifixion rendered as luminous silhouetted forms on a subtly modeled series of round white surfaces. The painted initial offers an object lesson in the ritual performance for which it was painted, that part of the ritual of the Mass when the Eucharistic elements of wine and wheaten wafer were sacramentally changed into the body and blood of Christ. A daily event commemorating and recapitulating the wounding of Christ's body on the cross and his voluntary submission to a violent unmaking in order to redeem humanity and to remake the relationship between God and his cosmic creation. The initial's arresting meditation on Christ's wounded embrace of the material of his sacramental Eucharistic body is not an isolated statement within the massive 5-volume ritual book to which it belongs. In another Te Igitur initial in the manuscript's 2nd volume, we encounter Christ in the Winepress, a visual schema inspired by passages from both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The initial stages a high-pressure scene. Carrying the cross on his back, Christ is bent double under a pressure that is at once the weight of the historical crucifixion and the ongoing force of contemporary Christian performances of the ritual of the Mass. Staggering under the burden of the cross, Christ bleeds copiously into the wine vat beneath his feet, his bent elbows and legs acting as ersatz, conduits for the streaks and rivulets of blood that descend toward the fruit below. As 2 angels add clusters of grapes to the press, a mixture of blood and the harvest of the vineyard is collected by a 3rd angel in the lower right foreground of the painting, who holds a chalice to receive the vibrant red runoff from the Christological winepress. Even as these 2 Te Igitur initials dramatize the sacramental body's material origins in the fruits of the field, positing that relationship as central to the supernatural reality and power of the Eucharist, they simultaneously work an aggressive sleight of hand. In both paintings, the manufacture of the wine and wafers consecrated in the Mass is presented as a metaphysical fait accompli. Christ trampling the bunch of grapes is at once a winemaker and the corporeal source of a bloody vintage. The cross that presses him downward evokes the large wood beams screwed down to exert pressure on harvested fruit within actual medieval presses. But the image eliminates the human laborers who worked those presses. So too, in the right-hand Te Igitur initial, the wheat stalk that runs through Christ's body sprouts both ears of wheat and fully formed and impressed communion wafers. There is no winnowing, milling, or cooking to be seen here. Instead, communion wafers sprout, emphatically unmade by human effort or artifice, yet profoundly entangled with Christ's incarnate human form. In this respect, these late medieval paintings might be taken as powerful confirmations of the non-human agency and effects of materials that have been championed by much work on materiality or pursued under the rubric of the so-called material turn, not least by scholars studying the Middle Ages. As an art historian, I know that materials matter in all times and in all places. But I also know that the visions of painful, redemptive entanglement compellingly offered to our eyes in these initials are the results of human labor and artifice. Christ's redemptive passivity and the painful work of vibrant vegetal matter in these images were fashioned with deliberation, skill, and force by human hands. the hands that painted the image, that ground the pigments, that pounded metal into fragile sheets of leaf, that scraped and stretched the parchment. To create these complex visual meditations on the material and supernatural entwining of the human and the non-human, a number of medieval workers forcibly subjected materials, animal, vegetable, and mineral, to various extreme transformations. Long after these initials were painted, circa 1863, Emily Dickinson distilled her own reflections on the interplay of force and art in a poem that I take as an epigram for my talk. And I'm showing you her handwritten composition here. Essential oils are wrung, the attar from the rose, be not expressed by suns alone. It is the gift of screws. The general rose decay, but this in lady's drawer makes summer, when the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary. This poem has been widely read as a commentary on Dickinson's understanding of poetry, which, like the extraction of essential oil from a rose, involves an arduous process of distillation in order to win a refined and concentrated work of art from natural language. Dickinson's general rose may decay, but its extracted essential oil can make summer out of season, evocatively and sensually lingering in lady's drawer, even after its possessor has disappeared from view to lie in ceaseless rosemary, that is, in the grave. Dickinson's letters and her 2 albums of pressed plants, today kept at Harvard University, reveal that she was an attentive cultivator and cataloger of plant life, including, as you may notice, cannabis. In the Essential Oils poem, however, she turned from acts of tending and preservation to the dynamics of destruction in creation. The essence of the rose, she tells us, is not expressed by the natural action of sunlight or vegetative growth alone. It must be wrung from the blossom. It is the gift of screws. Dickinson's attar of roses is at once essential, consoling, enduring, and a decidedly unnatural result of the transformative, inventive pressure of human effort, that is, of culture. In what follows, I take Dickinson's poem as an invitation and provocation to consider the role of force and of unmaking in the creation of works of art in medieval Europe and in medieval Christian conceptions of the work of salvation. Like Dickinson's attar of rose, many medieval works of art were wrested and wrung from constituent materials, produced by skillful deployments of intellectual and manual force. They were and are a powerful material archive of both creation and destruction. Indeed, many, I think most, medieval works of art and architecture involve the material destruction or substantial deconstruction of materials, including prior works of art and architecture. In some medieval works of art, the presence of unmaking in acts of material creation is itself taken up and explored as a dynamic with profound implications, not only for aesthetic economies, but also for the economy of salvation as medieval Christian people imagined it. My lecture will focus on the forceful, sometimes even violent handling of materials, both in concrete and in elusive or conceptual terms. In practice and in imagination, medieval Christians in Europe took up materials as a powerful means of shaping the world. They did so in ways both beautiful and disturbing. History teaches us that these are not mutually exclusive effects or results. In this talk, I'm particularly interested in tracing how acts of skillful unmaking, practiced creatively, productively, and with destructive force, were involved not only in the making of artful works in the medieval period, but also in medieval Christian conceptions of the work of salvation, not least as it was conceived in relation to the Eucharist. The practices of unmaking played a crucial role in the making of medieval art can be perhaps most concretely exemplified by considering sculpture made by carving. Carving is fundamentally a subtractive act, We usually perceive and discuss the sculptural forms realized by carving wood, walrus tusk, elephant ivory, alabaster, stone, and yet other materials as positive plastic forms, volumetrically projecting in space. The making of these forms, however, proceeded by removing material. Although art historians sometimes characterize this process as if it involved, quote, releasing or relieving plastic forms from an original quantity or block of material, one could equally and more accurately, perhaps, describe the carver's work as a process of creating voids where once there was material substance. A mid-13th century statue of the Virgin and Child unearthed in the Place de Furstenberg in Paris in 1999, they were excavating to build a parking lot and found this, powerfully confronts its beholder with the dynamics of destruction and creation that are my focus today. Today installed within an adjacent church of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the statue has been identified as a first attempt at a central Trumeau figure for the portal of a chapel at the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and I'm going to show you. So it would have, we think, been in this central vertical element here. The statue was intended to stand here. This chapel was begun in 1245, probably completed by the mid-13th century, and then demolished in 1802. And today the portal, which you see on the right, is partially preserved in the collection of the Musée Cluny in Paris. The Virgin and Child sculpture's current condition is, however, not the result of the French Revolution's iconoclasm or of the 19th century demolition. Rather, the sculpture was abandoned before it was completely carved, and its form, broken in 3 parts, was buried as part of the foundation, the substructure of a wall at the monastery in the 13th century. As the art historian and curator Xavier Decteau has observed, thanks to this abandonment of the sculpture before it was finished, the carving we have today affords us an unparalleled encounter with 13th century Parisian stone carving techniques as a repertoire of differentiated, skilled actions performed upon the limestone. Different areas of the block exhibit remarkably different degrees of finish. Whereas the Virgin's face has been volumetrically defined and the fine details of her upper and lower eyelids, nose, and her lips, compressed in a slight smile, have been worked with considerable finesse and precision, in the part of the block that would have become the Virgin's crown, the carver has removed enough stone to give us a sense of the general volume and position of the crown and nothing more. Now, the Virgin and Child was carved from a block of Lutetian limestone, a type of stone quarried in the area around Paris whose material properties made it particularly well suited to and sought out for the carving of monumental figural sculpture at this time. In 13th century France, the artists who carved such sculptures preferred, when possible, to work with a particular kind of Lutetian limestone called liais de Paris. This kind of limestone was geologically formed in subterranean beds with a thickness or depth ranging from 20 to 45 centimeters. It was in the thickest beds, those getting close to 45 centimeters in depth, that carvers obtained the blocks they employed in the carving of large-scale monumental sculpture like this unfinished Virgin and Child. Now, if we imaginatively complete the figure's form with reference to a roughly contemporary but much smaller Virgin and Child carved in ivory, also made in Paris, bearing in mind Janet Snyder and art historians' discoveries concerning the standardized block sizes of liais de Paris employed for monumental sculpture, we can begin to envision what the process of carving subtracted from the block. We can, as it were, start to see the stone substance that the artist unmade in order to make the positive plastic form of the sculpture. It was the material properties of liais de Paris, its fine grain and hardness in particular, that allowed medieval carvers to work it with precision. But the properties or affordances, to use a contemporary term, of the specific block of liais de Paris selected to become this Virgin and Child did not respond well or as expected to the carver's tools and the force of the artist's work on the block. A dramatic vertical fissure splits the block from top to bottom. Very likely, the block fractured during the process of carving. This material breakdown, or literal breaking apart of the block, sealed its fate. Broken into 3 fragments, the incompletely carved sculpture was recycled and repurposed as the subterranean footing for a wall. Throughout the Middle Ages, builders and patrons of buildings did not hesitate to repurpose already carved stones for new ends. From the beginning to the end of the medieval period, we find widespread evidence that stone was removed from pre-existing structures in order to supply materials for the construction of new edifices and monuments. The motivations for such unmaking of stone structures and monuments range from the pragmatic, simply needing the stone, to the political and the religious. This long-lived medieval practice of quarrying older buildings and monuments defines an extra pictorial ground for the triumphalist visual rhetoric of the bas de page scenes painted in the 2 surviving calendar pages of the Belleville Breviary. Each vignette presents a startling scene. On the far left, we see a stone building collapsing in upon itself. Standing next to this ruin, a Jewish prophet holds gray masonry blocks from the building in his hands as he turns towards the figure of an apostle standing next to him. In turn, the energetic forms of the apostles engage in 2 actions at once. With their right hands, they grasp and pull white veils away from the prophets and from the scrolls inscribed with prophecy that unfurl in the space between the 2 figures. At the same time, each apostle holds a section of that scroll featuring an article of the Apostles' Creed, a statement of Christian belief, in his left hand. As if the polemical, supersessionist claims of these painted figures were not clear enough, they are preceded by a very unusual explanation in textual form, couched in the first-person voice of the image's designer. And this text really drives the point home. I'm going to show you the original text as it appears in the manuscript together with these paintings, and I'm going to read my English translation. First, there are the apostles, who are the executors of the New Testament, who gather the obscurely conveyed phrases of the Old Testament and uncover and elucidate them, and from them make the articles of the Christian faith. Thus, in each of the 12 months, there is one of the 12 apostles and one of the 12 prophets, in such a manner that the prophet gives to the apostle a covered prophecy, and the apostle uncovers it and makes an article of the creed from it. And because we speak of the synagogue that existed in the time of the Old Testament and the church in the time of the New in 2 ways, in the gross and material sense and in a subtle and spiritual sense, I put one sense and the other, that is, in the image. For behind each one, there is a material synagogue from which the prophet draws a stone which he conveys to the apostle together with the prophecy. And this synagogue constantly diminishes as the days progress. And the articles of the creed increase, just as you can see in the figures, close quote. In the manuscript's 2 surviving calendar pages, which I'm showing you details from here, the progressive ruination of the synagogue keeps pace with the unveiling of prophetic wisdom and its transformation in the hands of the apostles into a series of scrolls inscribed with the articles of the Christian creed. The paintings picture the Christian quarrying of the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish religion in strikingly literal form. The synagogue's gray masonry arches and walls collapse inward as one prophetic hand after another is forced by painting to unmake its architecture so that the apostles can employ the material substance of the synagogue in the construction of their Christian church. The paintings in the bas de page of the Belleville Breviary are a beautiful demonstration of what highly accomplished 14th century painters could do with the materials of their craft and with their own ingenuity and imagination. But even as we may admire these paintings, we need also to recognize how they participate in and perpetuate an aggressive tradition of Christian appropriation and destructive quarrying of Jewish sacred texts and the Jewish religion. We have already encountered a striking visual formulation of such unmaking and repurposing of the Hebrew Bible in this image of Christ in the winepress, an iconographic motif that forcefully reinterprets Jewish prophetic texts to make them speak of Christ, and more specifically of his Eucharistic body consumed in the Christian ritual of the Mass. And this illuminated initial is but one example from a large and diverse body of medieval artworks that frame the material origins of Christ's Eucharistic body in overtly triumphalist terms. Midway down the length of the south aisle of the former monastery church of the Madeleine at Vézelay in France, a carved capital presents us with a milling scene. Often given the title by modern scholars of the mystic mill capital, many art historians have seen the figure on the left of this capital, who shoulders a sack of grain and carefully pours its contents into a hopper connected to a wheel, as Moses. His companion, bent double to hold open the mouth of a second sack below the outlet of the hopper, has often been identified as St. Paul. Now, as Kirk Ambrose has observed, nothing in the carving of the block, nor in the larger context of the church in which the sculpture is found, supports this interpretation of the capital. It is instead an interpretation that relies heavily on circumstantial evidence provided by two largely lost works of medieval stained glass. A panel from the so-called anagogical or allegorical window devised by Abbot Suger for a chapel in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in France, and another stained glass window once found in the transept of Canterbury Cathedral in England, made sometime between 1175 and 1220. Neither of these stained glass windows survives intact. Our knowledge of their complex visual statements derives from medieval textual sources. One of those sources, the text that Abbot Suger wrote about his own administrative efforts at his monastery of Saint-Denis, describes the stained glass window at Saint-Denis as, quote, urging us onward from the material to the immaterial. And Suger goes on to say that in one part, this window, quote, represents the Apostle Paul turning a mill and the prophets carrying sacks to the mill, close quote. Now, although the 12th century stained glass panel that Suger describes is lost, except for a few fragments, we have this 19th century reconstruction of the scene, which I show you here, with the warning that we can't entirely trust how this reconstruction represents the original window. In his discussion of the window, Suger includes what he calls the verses of its materials, so poetry that was worked into the window. And I'm going to read my English translation, and I'll show you the original Latin. O Paul, by working the mill, you take the flour from the bran. You make known the inward things of the Mosaic law. From so many grains, the true bread without bran is made, our perpetual and angelic food. The second early example of the so-called mystical mill iconography has been identified in another panel of stained glass from a window once in Canterbury Cathedral. According to a textual source describing the Canterbury window, it once featured a scene that was concisely identified as, quote, mill, oven, and apostles making bread, close quote. But the text also preserves the poetry worked into the window. Quote, what the old law and the new grinds with its pair of millstones, that is your passion, cross, your words, O Christ, your food, close quote. So in this short poem, the grinding force of milling is taken to figure the mechanical, decimating collaboration of the so-called old and new laws. That is, of the law God gave to Moses and the Israelites and the new law of Christianity. Like the two millstones, the so-called old and new laws grind the grain of Christ's teaching and his passion to produce a sacramental divine food, the Eucharistic wafer made of water and wheat. In the stained glass windows at Saint-Denis and Canterbury, to crush, shred, and otherwise unmake the ear of wheat was presented as an act of divine revelation, an abrasive releasing of the nourishing wheat of Christian truth from the bran of Jewish law. In later medieval variants on the mystic mill theme, the identification of milled flour with the Eucharist and thereby with Christ comes even more to the fore. A 15th century panel painting made in Ulm in Germany offers a complex, technocratic meditation on the transformation of wheat into sacrament. The process begins with the grain poured out of sacks by the Virgin Mary and the 4 animal-headed evangelist figures and proceeds through the hidden inner surfaces of 2 millstones, resulting in a cascade of white communion wafers that tumble downward toward the haloed half-length figure of the Christ child, held in a chalice by the 4 Latin doctors of the Church. This counterfactual production process is propelled by the labor of the apostles, who turn a lateral shaft that translates the force of their collective exertion to the mill wheel above. The Ulm panel painting is but one late example from a proliferation of medieval texts and images in which the natural agricultural materials of the Eucharist, wheat and grape, and their material unmaking took center stage. From this large textual and visual tradition in which processes of material decimation and production do significant conceptual work, I want to briefly consider one particularly interesting medieval text that focuses on a rather depressing theme, namely the Livre de Tribulation, or Book of Tribulation. The Book of Tribulation tries to explain why bad things happen to good Christians and to not so good Christians. And to convince its readers, the tribulation confers no fewer than 12 essential benefits on Christian devotees. In the section of the tract devoted to purgation, the third benefit of tribulation, a series of material analogies comes to the fore. To give you a sense of how the tract uses material processes of unmaking and making to elaborate moral spiritual lessons, I'm going to read a selection of passages that I've translated into English, and I'm going to show you that English translation on the screen at the same time. Quote, "The other manner of purification rendered by tribulation is that of the grapevine, in cutting back the vine stalk. Jesus Christ speaks about this purgation in the gospel, where he says, 'My Father will purge the branches that do not bear fruit, so that the vine will be more fruitful.' And if the wise winemaker knows to cut back the overgrown branches of his vine, do not marvel if that God who has undertaken to win you cuts back what you love too much or amass excessively in this world with the sickle of death that he holds in his hand. Next, understand that tribulation is offered to you in order to purify your heart in the manner in which grain is purged when it separates from the straw under the blow of the flail. For just as the blow of the flail forces the grain to separate from the straw, so tribulation compels the heart to separate from love of the world. Do not complain, St. Augustine says, about the flail of tribulation, if you wish to have your grain be pure and you desire to be put in that heaven where there will be nothing but pure grain. Next, tribulation serves to purge you in the way that the press serves the wine. For just as the precious liquor is separated from the base and gross matter of the residue by the press that holds the grapes, likewise has God sent you into the press and there removes the infirmities of the body, the persecutions of the enemy, and the other tribulations and troubles of this life in order to purify your heart. Do not refuse the press if you wish to be put in the cellar." The approach to more spiritual and moral improvement promoted by the Book of Tribulation might be described as an ordeal of subjectivity, elaborated in a series of analogies derived from medieval ways of working, or more accurately, working over materials. The analogies employed in the text to assert the value of suffering have in common a pronounced emphasis on the skillful application of force, a force verging on violence in the text's own terms. The text's extended discussion of how suffering purifies the Christian devotee culminates in its extended discussion of metallurgy. Quote, "The other manner of purgation which we mentioned above concerns metal, gold by fire, iron by file. Tribulation thus purifies the elect in the way that fire purifies gold. As St. Augustine says, as fire is to gold, so tribulation is to the just man. And understand that of all the metals, gold is the most precious and lead is the most base. And nevertheless, gold cannot be perfectly refined without lead. For to refine gold in the furnace, one needs to melt lead with it, and the lead attracts to itself the metals and all the poor material of the gold, and in this way the lead serves the gold. In such a manner the just are purged and refined by the wicked, who are signified by lead and called lead in Scripture, just as it is written of them in Isaiah, all these just as lead. And this is actually Ezekiel. If then you ask me, what service the wicked do for the good, he answers you, that they serve just as the lead serves gold. In this passage, we find a strikingly in-the-know account of the metallurgical process of assaying and cupellation. Like an expert goldsmith or metallurgist working with silver and gold in a mint or a workshop, tribulation, unwittingly assisted by leaden, wicked people, tests and refines the Christian subject, separating her or his inner precious metal from the dross of moral and spiritual baseness. Now, the anonymous author or authors of the Book of Tribulation clearly presumed that the extended metallurgical analogy they employed would resonate with readers and listeners, and they had good reason for this assumption. As recent scholarship has shown, knowledge of and interactions with precious metals, particularly in the form of money, were far more widespread over the course of the Middle Ages than was once thought. In England, where indigenous out-of-the-ground supplies of gold and silver are and were negligible, the most consistent, quantitatively significant sources of the noble metals of silver and gold used in making coins and much precious metalwork came both from recycling the metal substance of pre-existing English and foreign coins, and from already existing metalwork objects that were melted down and recycled to provide the material for new money. Already before the Norman conquest in 1066, rulers in England periodically called in the coinage, a practice that demanded, really legally required, everyone who possessed coins to bring their money to mints so that it could be melted down, realloyed, and made into new coins, which then they could come back and claim. From 1158 to 1281, no fewer than 4 complete recoinages were undertaken in England. 2 partial recoinages also took place from 1205 to 1207, and then again, coins were called in, melted down, and made into new coins in 1300. The estimated volume or total quantity of recoinage output from English mints in this period of time is pretty staggering. Over the course of the 4 recoinages that took place from 1158 to 1250, Martin Allen's rigorous analyses have shown that the silver coins issued by mints in England were composed of something, a minimum of 70 to a maximum of 90% of recycled metal. In England, the quantity of available silver was, no doubt, affected by the Crown's commitment to a very high level of silver content in coins, a legal stipulation that today we call the sterling standard. In the medieval period, this amounted to a legal requirement that each silver coin would be composed of 92.5% pure silver. Similarly, the first truly circulating English gold coin, the so-called double leopard, introduced in 1344, contained an extremely high percentage of pure gold, so much so that it failed as a currency and was demonetized in the year it was issued. The English royal standard for gold coinage, which was established in 1349, set the pure gold content of coins minted in England at 23 carat, 3.5 grains fine. That is 994.8 parts per thousand, or approximately 99.5% pure gold. In other words, gold coins minted in England in the 14th century contained only 1/2 of a grain, or 0.5% of base metal. And this was the very minimum needed of non-gold metal to give these coins the kind of hardness they needed to undergo the mechanical process of hammering and the striking of coins, and to retain their impressed texts, motifs, and round forms once they went out in the world and started to be circulated and handled. Medieval awareness and appraisal of the material composition of coins is addressed directly by a text called the Treatise on the New Money, which is written in England circa 1286 to 87. And this text really gives us a glimpse of how medieval people looked at and appraised coins. They were really connoisseurs of money in a way that I think is hard for us to understand in our handling of money today. Knowledge of the material of which money is made, namely gold, silver, and copper, is obtained in two ways, either distinguishing them by eye or testing them by assay. We can distinguish by the eye whether the material is in a mass or in coin. So much everyone knows. Secondly, whether it is gold, silver, or copper. This too, many know. Thirdly, whether it is pure gold or pure silver or mixed with another metal, but most people do not know this. Fourthly, how much the pound of mixed gold or silver contains of the metal with which it is alloyed. This can only be known by experts who have learned by practice. A sure knowledge of gold and silver can be obtained by testing, but among a great variety of tests, examination by assay is considered the most certain, and hardly anyone can know its certain signs unless he has learned it from practice in the art." Close quote. As this text asserts, medieval English kings elevated the practice of assaying or testing coins to a high art. In England, a quasi-ritualized testing of the coinage called the Trial of the Pyx is first securely documented in 1248, and it continues to be performed today. According to the earliest known description of the procedures for the trial of the Pyx, 1 penny from each 10 pounds of silver coins made at a mint was put into a special container called a pyx that was locked with 2 keys, each kept by a different official. The coins inside this pyx were to be assayed, that is, to be melted down to separate out the precious metal from the base metal 4 times a year, and the master of the mint would be punished if the material composition of the tested coins did not conform to the legal silver or gold standard. Now, the name given to this periodic auditing of the material makeup of coins, the trial of the pyx, derives from the locked container in which samples of coins to be melted down and analyzed were kept. Between trials, the pyx container was itself kept in the so-called pyx chapel, a small chapel located within Westminster Abbey's east cloister. And just as a side note, I discovered this recently, the chapel's role in this convergence of money and the sacred is still clearly a point of pride for Westminster Abbey. They've been tweeting this on an annual basis for the last few years. So I find the storage of samples of newly minted coins in a pyx in this chapel at Westminster very suggestive. Because in the Middle Ages, the word pyx usually designated the small locked receptacles in which consecrated communion wafers were stored in churches, so they could be used in the last rites or could give Christians a Eucharist to adore outside of the ritual performance of the Mass. Like the consecrated communion wafers reserved in pyxes in medieval churches, the coins stored in the Westminster pyx were precious things kept under lock and key in sacred space. And they too, like the Eucharist, were objects destined to be destroyed, in fact, designed to be destroyed by processes of material consumption. In Capital, that old materialist, Karl Marx, observed that, quote, "For a coin, the road from the mint is also the path to the melting pot," close quote. This was certainly true in the Middle Ages, and it was a matter of common knowledge. Medieval people who made use of coins were well aware of the potential financial, but also material liquidity of the metal species they handled. The widespread and routine unmaking of coins in the Middle Ages has implications not simply for the economic and material cultures of the European Middle Ages, but also for our histories of art and objects in the Middle Ages. Indeed, it seems likely that most of the gold leaf, the shell gold, silver leaf, and silver paint that we encounter today in medieval works of art were once incarnated in the form of coins. Italian sources from the 14th century stipulate that gold coins should be used to produce gold leaf used in works of art. In his late medieval artist manual, Cennino Cennini states that no more than 100 sheets of gold leaf should be produced from a single gold coin. And recent technical analyses of the gold grounds in a number of late medieval Italian panel paintings have demonstrated that the material composition of these gold backgrounds is consistent with the substance of contemporary medieval gold coins. The gold and silver incorporated in medieval works of art were always the material products of acts of unmaking. In some cases, they were the material results of the transmutation of money into art in quite literal terms. In texts discussing artisanal and artistic techniques in the Middle Ages, we read of materials pounded, extracted, ground down, drowned in liquid reagents, and then dried by fire or the heat of the sun, only to be submerged, suspended, bound by egg whites themselves, vigorously beaten with water, or else fixed with gum arabic. From the mineral, vegetable, and metallic point of view, the medieval workshop must have been a chamber of horrors. If we turn to Theophilus Presbyter's 12th century instructions for making shell gold, a kind of gold used by manuscript painters and the kind of gold you see in this beautiful initial, we can get a sense of how strenuously worked over the materials of art making were before the industrial miracle of the paint tube. To make shell gold, Theophilus tells us we must, quote, take some pure gold and file it very finely into a very clean bowl or basin and wash it with a paintbrush in the shell of a tortoise or a shell taken from the sea. Then have a mill with a pestle, each cast from an alloy of copper and tin, so blended that there are 3 parts of pure copper and a 1/4 of tin, unadulterated with lead. When this mill has been arranged, the gold, after careful cleaning, is placed in it. A little water is added, the pestle is inserted, the upper piece of wood fitted, and the thong is drawn and allowed to run back again. It is again drawn and again runs back, and this is continued for 2 or 3 hours. Next, the upper piece of wood is removed, and the pestle is washed in the same water with a paintbrush. Then the mill is taken up. The gold and water are stirred to the bottom with a paintbrush and left a little until the coarser part settles. In a short while, the water is poured into a very clean basin, and whatever gold comes away with the water is ground. Then, after renewing the water, it is again milled in the same way as before until it all comes away with the water. In like manner, one grinds silver, bronze, and copper. But gold should be more carefully ground and should be gently worked and examined more often because it is softer than other metals, for fear it should stick firmly to the mill and conglomerate. Then, if this happens, the conglomeration is scraped away and taken out, and what remains is milled into completion. Pour off the surface of the water together with the impurities. Carefully wash the gold in a clean shell. Pour water onto it, stir it again, and when you have it in your hand for an hour, pour this water into another shell, retaining the very fine particles which come away with the water. And do this again, a 4th and a 6th and a 7th time, and in this way you wash silver, bronze, and copper. All of this skilled, demanding, tedious, and exhausting labor for the glittering effects of shell gold set down by the brush's movement upon a prepared parchment surface. I'm going to conclude by turning one last time to the initials with which I began. I want to suggest, looking at these paintings again, that the forceful, skilled unmaking of materials and the making of works of art that I've explored is integral to the beautiful yet painful rhetoric of these paintings and the vision of salvation they elaborate. As the angel catches the elixir of blood and wine that streams from the winepress, surely the vibrant red runoff was nothing more or less than a hard-won passage of red paint for the artist Bertold Furtmeyer. And so too, the wounded and wounding embrace of Christ in the fruit from the field figures the painter Ulrich Scheyer's delicate handling of the difficult stuff of his art. The chalky pigments, the shell gold, and the gold leaf, pounded until it became a thin, fragile sheet. Countless acts of artifice, of material destruction, and forced transmutation went into these painted visions of a material world implicated in its own sacramental redemption. There are too many ordeals of substance, too many moments of material unmaking to be counted in these paintings. And they were not made to invite that kind, perhaps our kind, of arithmetic. These paintings, or rather the artists who made them, invite us to consider the presence and force of unmaking and making, proposing Christ's sacramental body as a figure for the artist's testing, forceful, and transformative labor. They frame the touch of the artist's hand as a kind of wounding that also redeems. Thank you.
How did you arrive at the study of this materiality?
I just became very interested in the fact that we never talked about the medievalists, and art historians, two really fundamental things. One, the communion wafers, the Mass is hugely important to European Christians in the Middle Ages, that they're made by mechanical means. There are special presses used to make them, and that they're images. They're low relief monochrome multiples. And once I started thinking about that, I started realizing that actually this is a deliberate, sustained thing to kind of invest a ton of thought and energy and design in the making of these things, but in such a way that they don't have any trace of the human hand on them. And this is a period of time when almost everything, that people engage in daily life is made by human hands and often has traces of the human hands that make it. So this got me thinking about the image, the Eucharist as an image, but the Eucharist also as a multiple. And from there, the questions of how is this being produced? What are the material conditions of producing this started taking me in a lot of directions. Yeah, so the question was, how long has the research process that you guys have seen the fruits of in the talk taken? There are two ways of answering this. About these particular paintings, I probably spent about 6 months. I went to go see them, which involves travel and sitting in a library. But the broader aspect of your question, so how long have I been doing research around these issues? For the book that this comes out of, about 7 years. But I've actually been studying medieval art in one way or another since I was 20 years old. So that's 25 years. So the question is, what drew me to this line of work, and do I have a particular piece that really speaks to me? I think that I'm really interested in how and why people make things. And as a historian, objects that seem to be at the center of a culture, that kind of dictate terms to other things in the culture made by human beings, these are always really fascinating to me. And so I think that's why I've been working on the Eucharist, why money fascinates me. I think money is actually money is a kind of aspect of our daily lives that often it's artists who remind us of. So there have been a long chain of artists from the earliest monies to today who have really thought about the money form, have been involved in making money. So, I've shown you some things I really love, and I think it's kind of the way I felt about my stuffed animals when I was a child. I don't want to pick one and say that it's the best. I want to love them all equally. But as I tried to emphasize in the talk, I think there's also, particularly medieval art, but it's true of art of other eras and cultures, there's a lot that's disturbing here that we should not love. We may find it powerful, we may find it aesthetically captivating, but I don't think I want to love some of the images I study. I think that they participate in forms of violence within their historical moment and actually have been conscripted to justify forms of violence in our moment in ways that I don't want to have any sense of sympathy with.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Aydin.
Thank you very much.